Greetings, America. Tonight's special evening broadcast is being brought to you by NSNCB. The dropping of an atomic bomb on Hiroshima took the world by surprise. Even Americans had no idea that their nation was developing a weapon of mass destruction. New details are being released about the development of the atomic bomb, codenamed the Manhattan Project, including the number of Americans and citizens involved. Over 130,000 Americans were involved in the Manhattan Project. So how was the U.S. able to keep the project a secret with so many Americans being involved? Here are some new details about the project and how Americans involved were able to keep it a secret. It all started in early 1939 when news that the Germans had began experimenting with the splitting of uranium atoms led scientists to believe that Germany was attempting to create a weapon of mass destruction. Scientist Albert Einstein was living in Germany at the time, but was forced to evacuate in order to avoid Nazi prosecution. When he arrived in the United States, he informed President Roosevelt of how dangerous an atomic weapon in the hands of Nazi Germany would be. Roosevelt was uneasy at first, but agreed to start a project that would design and build an atomic bomb, named the Manhattan Project. At first, the project started off slowly, but picked up speed when Enrico Fermi was able to produce the first controlled nuclear reaction. Robert Oppenheimer was put in charge of the main facility plant in Los Alamos, New Mexico. On July 16, 1945, the first atomic bomb was tested, and it was successful. The Manhattan Project created many opportunities for citizens in the United States. At its peak, more than 130,000 people were employed by the project. At the Oak Ridge Center of the Manhattan Project was a town of 70,000 workers, most of the workers being women. Anna McCusick, who worked in the Oak Ridge Center, remembers someone asking her, "Are you a woman who happens to be a physicist, or a physicist that happens to be a girl?" Women weren't seen as capable of handling such a daunting task, but this project gave women the opportunity to directly affect the outcome of the war, and affect the outcome they did. However, all of this opportunity didn't come without oppression to others. Black scientists were freely accepted to work on the project. Many of the scientists were immigrants already, and they found the discrimination of blacks repugnant. However, when the project was moved south to Oak Ridge, the blacks who were already working on the project were not allowed to move to the new Secrete City. The only role that blacks could play on the project now were as labor workers that lived in segregated houses from the other workers and scientists. It's ironic how immigrants freely accepted black scientists on the project while the U.S. government didn't. The U.S. had no issues with white immigrants working on the project, but they had problems with black Americans working on it. People were building a bomb that would end the war. Even though it killed many Americans, it was necessary to prevent further American deaths. Those who worked in the Manhattan Project weren't told anything except that they'd be helping to win the war. Americans were so willing to help out their country that they would do anything even with very limited information. The act of dropping the first bomb on Hiroshima showed immense American patriotism, solely in the fact that the feat of creating, testing, transporting, and dropping the bomb had been done without flaw. As inhumane as one may believe it to be, this historical event couldn't have been done by any of the superpowers of the world at the time. By dropping the atom bomb on firstly Hiroshima, Americans showed patriotism by saving the lives of many American soldiers. Operation Downfall, the military attack on the Japanese mainland that would have occurred had the atomic bombs not been dropped, would have been the largest amphibious operation in world history. This meant that Operation Downfall also would have been one of the most costly invasions and one of the bloodiest, with Allied casualties estimated to reach into the millions. These caused a great burden to Americans at the front and at home, but it would also take much more time than the atomic bombs did. Japanese surrender was announced only 11 days after the first bomb was dropped. Nothing is more patriotic than being the first country to accomplish a task and saving millions of lives while doing it. Hundreds of thousands of Americans were involved in the Manhattan Project, which created and tested the biggest explosive device to ever wreak havoc on this earth. The patriotism of the American Air Force and the B-29 Enola Gay bomber team led the bomb to its final destination. Due to the lack of negotiation, even after the first bomb, the second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, and finally Japan surrendered, bringing the war in the Pacific to an end. Americans sacrificed a lot to leave their families and work on something they had very limited information about. Out of the 130,000 Americans working on the project, a very select few actually knew what the project was about. This is how the US kept the project a secret. The project was broken up into isolated sub-projects. People managed one sub-project and often would know nothing about the other sub-projects. People who had managed these sub-projects would report to a superior if they needed any information. Workers would only know enough for their job. This was called compartmentalization. Only a few government officials knew about the Manhattan Project, but they didn't know enough details. Wartime security was also in place. People were told things like, what you do here, what you see here, what you hear here. When you leave here, you let it stay here. People had to work long hours without knowing who and what they were working for. Many women had worked on this project and had similar experiences to the men. In interviews from Voices of the Manhattan Project, women had described these experiences. Colleen Black had said, "We climbed around on the pipes and found the leaks, and marked them, and sent them back if they were leaking, and sent them on if they were not. You did not talk about your job." These experiences show us that just as the men, they did not know much outside of their job. America was a land of sacrifice, as men and women who had worked extremely hard in the Manhattan Project, without knowing what it was, so Americans could finally win the war against Japan. That wraps up this segment of NSNCB. Thank you for joining us, and we hope you learned about the opportunity, oppression, patriotism, and sacrifice that went into the development of the atomic bomb.